Sarah Whitmore was born in the spring of 1946 in the quiet hills outside Lexington, Kentucky, just as the world was slowly catching its breath after the long, brutal years of war. Her father, James Whitmore, had returned from the European front a decorated Army corporal, carrying both the pride of service and the weight of things he never spoke about. He came home with a limp in his right leg and a stubborn silence that settled over him like the dust on their farm. Her mother, Elaine, was a homemaker who worked tirelessly to keep the family afloat. She scrubbed the laundry of wealthier families in town until her fingers cracked, always with a sophism on her lips and worry in her eyes. They owned a small plot of land, a patch of earth that barely yielded enough to live on, but it was theirs. The Whitmores were poor, dirt poor, but they were proud. James kept the American flag raised at the edge of their property, rain or shine. He believed in service, in duty, and in the quiet strength of enduring hard times without complaint. Sarah was their only child, a thin, doe-eyed girl with long chestnut hair and a soft, steady gaze. From the time she could walk, she followed her father around the fields and listened to his footsteps more than his words. There was a gentleness to her, a stillness that made her seem older than her years. But there was something else, something people in town whispered about. Sarah didn't speak, or rather, she barely did. When she did try, the words came out tangled, broken, halting like a record skipping. Doctors called it selective mutism. Teachers called it a learning disability. But folks in town just said, "She's real quiet." She went to school like any other child, riding the rickety yellow bus into town, sitting alone by the window, always watching. In the classroom, she took the back corner seat, clutching her worn notebook and avoiding eye contact. She never raised her hand, never read aloud, but she listened. She listened so carefully that even the teachers noticed. She could recite entire lessons back when asked in private. Her eyes missed nothing. It wasn't that Sarah didn't have thoughts or feelings. She just carried them differently. While other girls her age giggled and whispered secrets behind cupped hands, Sarah walked quietly through the hallways, absorbing every word, every glance. She wasn't invisible, but she made others feel seen. Her presence had a way of grounding a room. Her stutter didn't define her in the house. Her parents never pushed her to speak more than she wanted. Her father, perhaps because of his own battles with silence, understood her. He taught her how to mend a fence, how to oil a tractor, how to sit in silence and just watch the sun go down. When they did speak, it was with their hands. A nod, a gesture, a look. Words in their home were not the only form of expression. The war had left James with a tremor in his right hand and nights full of nightmares. Sometimes, Sarah would hear him cry out in the dark, and she'd quietly move to the porch and sit until morning. Her quiet presence was a comfort. Elaine would often say she was born with old eyes. Sarah didn't make friends easily. The other kids didn't know what to do with someone so silent. Some mocked her stutter, mimicking her attempts at speech behind her back. Others were simply indifferent. But Sarah never retaliated. She never complained. She just kept showing up day after day with her notebook and her silence. What she lacked in words, she made up for an observation. She knew which teachers were having a hard day before they said a word. She noticed when her bus driver had a limp after a weekend off. She paid attention to the way her classmates' faces changed when the principal walked in. She noticed a tremble in her father's hands when the 4th of July fireworks went off. And in 1963, something in town began to shift. Lexington was not the Deep South, but it was Southern enough. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum across the country, and even in their quiet corner of Kentucky, whispers of change were stirring. A new pastor came to town, a black man named Reverend Tillman, who preached about equality and justice from a small church on the east side. He drew a crowd, both loyal followers and hostile protesters. Sarah watched all of it. She listened to the murmurs in the general store, saw the way the sheriff stiffened whenever Reverend Tillman's name was mentioned. She saw the flyers torn down and put back up. She saw the brave faces of the children who began walking miles to attend integrated schools in the city. She said nothing, but she missed nothing. And in the spring of 1964, when Sarah turned 18, the moment that would define her life, and rewrite the memory of a town was quietly approaching. Sarah had never been asked to stand up for anything. She had never spoken out, never written a letter to the editor, never joined a march. She wasn't political. She wasn't loud. But she had spent 18 years watching her father carry invisible wounds from a war he couldn't explain, and she understood that not all battles were fought with rifles. Some were fought with dignity, with presence, with doing the right thing when no one expected you to. That spring, something happened at the public library, something small on the surface. But for Sarah Whitmore, it would become the moment her silence turned into a national voice. She had gone into town to buy flour and eggs for her mother. It was a quiet morning. Sunlight filtered through the sycamores lining Main Street. As she stepped out of the general store, she saw a small group of black students standing outside the library steps. They were trying to enter. The librarian blocked the doorway. A white man in a sheriff's hat stood beside her, arms folded. The students didn't shout. They didn't resist. They simply stood, books in hand, being told no. Sarah froze, paper bag in hand. No one saw her. Not really. She was just a quiet farm girl, just another background figure. But she saw them, and she didn't walk away. In that moment, something stirred in her, a memory, perhaps, of her father's silence, of her own years of being overlooked, unheard, unseen. Without a word, Sarah crossed the street. She didn't speak. She didn't protest. She didn't make a speech. She simply pulled her own library card from her pocket, placed it into the hand of a black girl who stood at the front of the group, and stepped aside to hold the door open. It lasted only a few seconds, but it would last forever in memory. Someone took a photo, and from that photo, history began to write her name. In the spring of 1964, just weeks before her 18th birthday, something happened in Lexington that would change the course of Sarah Whitfield's life forever, though no one realized it at the time. The town was still caught in the thick molasses of old ways, segregated schools, segregated diners, and yes, even a segregated library, one that stood like a stone fortress on the corner of Main and Miller. Inside were rows of neatly arranged books, the quiet hum of ceiling fans, and a stern librarian who followed every rule in the manual, especially the one that said certain people were not allowed to the front door. It was a Thursday afternoon when the event occurred. A group of 6 local black students, no older than Sarah herself, walked quietly to the front steps of the Lexington Public Library. They were dressed neatly. One of the boys even wore a tie. Their eyes were steady, but their hands shook just a little as they approached the doors. They didn't say much, only asked if they could get a library card, like any other citizen of the town. They were met with cruelty, angry words, spit. A man shouted something vile from across the street. A woman pulled her child close like danger was walking in broad daylight. The librarian, her name was Mrs. Agnes DeWitt, stepped out and slammed the door in their faces. She didn't need to say anything else. Sarah saw everything. She had just left the general store, her arms wrapped around a brown paper bag filled with flour, eggs, and a tin of baking soda. She was headed home when the shouting caught her ear. She stopped cold on the sidewalk across from the library, frozen like a photograph. Her heart thudded against her ribs, and for a moment she forgot to breathe. She didn't say a word, didn't cry out, didn't cross the street. She just stood there, watching something inside her quietly crack open. That night, Sarah didn't sleep. She lay awake in her narrow bed, the spring poking through the mattress, staring at the ceiling while her younger brother snored softly from across the room. She could still hear the voices from that afternoon, still see the fear in the girl's eyes, the one in the yellow dress who clutched her school books like they might protect her. And Sarah wondered what it meant to be quiet, to be invisible, to live your whole life never interrupting the world, but also never standing in its way. The next morning, while her mother scrubbed linens and her father patched the fence out back, Sarah got dressed without a word. She pulled on a plain blue dress, tied her hair back with a faded ribbon, and slipped her library card into the pocket of her coat. Then she walked to town. No one stopped her. No one knew where she was going. She just kept walking, her shoes scuffing the gravel as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. When she arrived at the library, the same crowd was there, fewer people, but the mood was unchanged. Angry eyes, folded arms, a silence that vibrated with judgment. Sarah didn't look at them. She walked slowly, deliberately up the library steps. Her hands didn't tremble. Her breath was steady. She paused at the top, then turned to a familiar face. One of the girls from the day before, standing just outside the doors, hesitant. Sarah reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her library card. Without saying a word, she held it out. The girl blinked in surprise, unsure what was happening. Sarah didn't explain. She didn't need to. She simply stepped aside, placed a hand on the heavy brass handle of the library door, and pulled it open. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She didn't look for approval. She just held the door, as though that was her only duty on earth. And the girl walked in. It wasn't dramatic. There was no applause. No one threw flowers or took photographs. The librarian stood stiff behind the counter, lips pressed tight. A man muttered something and spat on the ground. But no one stopped the girl. No one dragged her back outside. And Sarah, silent Sarah, who had never raised her hand in school, who had lived her life on the edge of every conversation, had just broken one of the oldest, ugliest rules in the town. When she let the door close behind her, Sarah didn't stay. She didn't browse the shelves or check out a book. She walked down the steps and headed home, where her mother scolded her for being late, and her father didn't say much at all. But something had shifted inside her, inside the town, even if no one said it out loud. Word spread quietly over the following days. Some folks whispered about that Whitfield girl and what she'd done. Others rolled their eyes and said it was just a fluke. But the black families in town, they remembered. The girl in the yellow dress remembered. And most of all, Sarah remembered. For the first time in her life, her silence hadn't made her invisible. It had made her unforgettable. Someone captured that moment with an old camera, a black and white photo, slightly grainy, with specks of dust on the lens, yet it carried a power no one expected. In the picture, Sarah stood silently at the library door, one hand holding it open, her eyes not fixed on anyone in particular, her face expressionless, and yet her entire posture radiated calm resolve. The young black girl beside her stepped onto the threshold and entered a place that just a day before it spat on her, rejected her, and threatened her dignity. No words were exchanged, but the world seemed to pause in that instant. The photo first appeared on the cover of a small civil rights publication in Atlanta. Days later, it reached the pages of the New York Times, then Life magazine, which published it under a now-famous headline. She didn't say a word, but she spoke volumes. What began as a snapshot from an unnoticed corner of America quickly turned into a symbol. It came to represent quiet resistance, a reminder that you don't need a shout to make change. You don't need a podium or a megaphone. You just need to stand in the right place at the right time and do the right thing. Silence, when grounded in principle, can echo louder than thunder. Within weeks, the spirit Sarah embodied began to spread. Protests broke out in nearby towns. High school students marched through streets holding placards with Sarah's image, her hair pulled back, her stance firm, her expression unwavering. On college campuses, students formed new groups under the banner of the Quiet Resistance Movement, naming Sarah's gesture as its spark. On national television, civil rights leaders began to speak of a silent strength, a new wave of protest not fueled by fiery speeches, but by deeply personal acts of courage. And through all the noise that followed, Sarah remained silent. She didn't speak to the press. She never appeared on television. She went back to school, still sitting quietly in the back row, never raising her hand, never uttering a word. But her name found its way into sociology classrooms, into lectures on civil rights, and onto posters tacked up in student centers across the country. She didn't say a word, but her story became the voice of a generation. Just 3 months after the photo made headlines, Sarah was found lying still at the edge of a wide cotton field. Authorities said it was an accident. She had slipped on a gravel path, hit her head on a rock, no witnesses, no sound. But not everyone believed that story. People in town whispered that her silence had made someone uneasy, that her small act had stirred the deepest, darkest corners of community desperate to keep things the way they were. No charges were filed. No investigation was opened. No answers were given. She left this world as quietly as she had moved through it. No voice, no goodbye, no letter. But what she left behind was far greater. The young black girl she had once held the door for, her name was Angela Franklin, grew up to become a civil rights attorney, a fierce, unrelenting one. When asked what had inspired her first steps, Angela simply said, "The quietest girl I ever met gave me the loudest permission to be who I was." Years later, that grainy black and white photo would hang in the Smithsonian, without any need for explanation. Sarah's name began appearing in high school history books, taught as part of the civil rights movement, a symbol of quiet courage. And in 1998, the United States Congress passed a resolution honoring her as a symbol of moral courage in silence. Sarah never spoke a word, but she left behind an echo the world couldn't ignore. And though no statue stands in her hometown, millions carry the memory of a girl who stood at the door of a small-town library and changed history with nothing but a nod and a quiet bravery to step aside. Sarah never spoke a word, not a single word, not a story, not an explanation, but her actions, her presence, spoke for an entire generation. It echoed through the years, breaking through all barriers of speech and silence, as a powerful reminder that courage doesn't always have to be loud. It doesn't need dazzling speeches or noisy slogans. Sometimes courage is simply standing there, quiet but firm, unshaken, and opening a door. Not just a small library door in a southern town, but the door to change, to freedom, to justice for countless people. That is the valuable lesson Sarah Whitmore left us. She reminds us that even when you feel small, invisible, or powerless, you can still make a difference. Sometimes all it takes is a single moment, a single choice, to speak for yourself without saying a word. Sarah didn't need to give a speech or go on the radio. She just stood there, silently, showing the world that courage can take the most unexpected, humble, yet powerful form. And now, her name lives forever in history books, in classrooms, in the hearts of millions. Her name is not just a name, but a symbol of resilience, silent sacrifice, and inner strength that words cannot fully capture. Sarah Whitmore became a symbol of moral courage, proof of the power of quiet action in some of America's most challenging times. If you're watching this video and sometimes feel life is too hard, too overwhelming, or you feel invisible in society, remember Sarah's story. Let her courage inspire you, because sometimes you don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to do something grand to make a change. Just stand firm, stay true, and courageously open even the smallest door, and you will have done what many cannot. Thank you for listening to the story of Sarah Whitmore, a simple woman with a strong heart and the powerful silence of courage. If you enjoy honest, inspiring stories about bravery and perseverance, please subscribe to Old Soldier Story so you won't miss more meaningful stories. Let's keep and spread the values of courage and resilience in life, because each of us can be a hero in our own story.